Grace and Edward Miller seemed the perfect couple. Their house on a quiet street in a small Vermont town looked as spotless as they were. The red door was always neatly painted, the garden was well tended, and a pair of wicker chairs hung cozily on the veranda. Grace was often presented as a successful lawyer and a caring wife, and Edward as the owner of a charming antique bookshop who simply adores his wife. They were the postcard couple that everyone loved, but perhaps a little envious of. Grace masterfully created the illusion of the perfect marriage. She always had a friendly smile, was supportive of her husband, and participated in all the town activities where she could meet friends and neighbors. And though no one could accuse her of not paying enough attention to Edward, sometimes it felt like it was all too carefully staged. Like when you took off your gloves and found that they were taped inside to keep the seams from coming apart. Edward, on the other hand, seemed more aloof, despite his outward charm. His demeanor had nothing to do with the liveliness with which he discussed books with his customers. He was more like a statue that smiles sweetly in photographs, but actually stands apart, barely touching reality. At times, his eyes glittered with some disturbing gleam, as if he was constantly thinking about something that remained a mystery even to his wife. Sophie and Jackson Hudson, their closest friends, were regular guests at the Miller home. Sophie was a bright, active woman with a short haircut and an infectious laugh, with whom Grace had been friends since her college days. They shared many moments of life, from parties to late-night tearful conversations with wine in the kitchen. Sophie seemed almost like a sister to Grace, though she was different, more frivolous and seemingly even carefree. Jackson, her husband, was a man of large build with a thick beard and kind eyes. He loved to party, and he kept Edward company on his rare occasions at home. When Sophie and Jackson were there, everything seemed perfect. Sophie would liven up the company with her laughter. Jackson would tell stories about how he and Edward had gone fishing once and almost drowned because of an old boat. And Grace and Edward would hug or share tender glances, as if they were a loving couple. As soon as the guests left, however, the silence in the house was almost deafening. Sophie was saying today that we're probably the happiest couple she knows, Grace remarked once, leaning back in the living room chair. Edward hadn't taken his eyes off the book he was reading, but when he heard his wife's voice, he only hummed briefly. Well, maybe Sophie just doesn't know enough happy couples. Grace grinned back, but her eyes betrayed a slight irritation. Those innocent jokes might have sounded funny to anyone, but to her, they cut to the chase. She'd often noticed that Edward avoided talking about his feelings, or at least keeping in touch for longer than a couple minutes if the conversation went beyond the mundane. It was like he was surrounded by an invisible wall, which Grace felt whenever she wanted to discuss something more personal. Over time, Grace began to notice little things that alarmed her. Edward's infrequent phone calls in the evening, for example. At first, she dismissed them as work-related, but when one of them interrupted their dinner, and Edward answered in a whisper in the hallway, Grace couldn't help but overhear. The conversation wasn't anything suspicious, just a discussion about some rare book order, but Grace felt an unpleasant pang in her chest. The party organized by the Millers a few days later was to enhance their public image. They had arranged a sumptuous dinner on the veranda. Grace, as always, looked flawless in her elegant dress, and Edward, in the suit she had chosen for him, seemed the most gallant. Sophie and Jackson were the first to arrive, and with them the evening was full of conversation, laughter, and jokes. Even Grace herself allowed herself a few glasses of wine and laughed louder than usual, but the tension beneath this merriment felt like a quiet vibration under the upholstery of an old armchair. In the kitchen, Grace suddenly noticed Edward stepping back to the window, and thinking no one could see him, frowning as if he were considering something. "Eddie," she said, stepping closer. "Are you okay? We're kind of having a party, not a funeral." Edward turned around and seemed as if he'd forgotten where he was for a moment. "Yeah, it's fine," he replied with a strained smile. "Just thinking about orders at the store. There's a lot piling up." "Of course it is," she tossed back with a slight chuckle. "I mean, it's always work. Maybe one day you'll make time for me too." The moment was quickly silenced by the laughter of the guests, who were already calling them back, but Grace was left with an unpleasant residue. Edward shirked the conversation again, as if he was afraid the frankness would backfire on him. As Grace cleaned up after the guests, she lingered in the kitchen. She remembered how Edward had looked almost nervous when he'd given her a piece of jewelry a few months ago. It had been an antique locket with a ruby he'd found in one of the antique stores. She had taken it as a nice token of attention at the time, but now she wondered if there might have been another reason behind it. Reflecting on her husband's behavior, Grace felt something strange. Not that she suspected him of anything in particular, but the feeling that something had gone wrong in their perfect marriage was becoming more and more intrusive. It was as if there was someone else in the house, an invisible guest whose presence she couldn't ignore. Grace sighed and grinned to herself. "Well, this is too much, Miller. You're not a detective." Edward was staying late at work more and more often. The store he'd opened on a whim a few years ago was suddenly demanding a lot more of his time and attention. At least that's what he'd told Grace. But something about those explanations seemed disingenuous to her. And it wasn't the work itself. Grace understood that he had busy days, like any businessman. The problem was that his voice was becoming more and more distant, and she could hear his laughter less and less often. One evening, when the clock was well past midnight, Edward came home, quietly closing the door behind him. Grace sat on the couch in the living room, pretending to watch TV, even though she was watching her third detective show. She wasn't even interested in the plot. She was just trying not to look at the clock, desperately clinging to the remnants of calm. "It's a little late tonight, isn't it?" she muttered without turning her head. Edward stopped on the threshold of the room, clearly not expecting to see her awake. "Yes, there were some problems with an order at the store," he replied, throwing off his coat. His face was tired, but there wasn't the same warmth in his eyes. "I wonder what those problems are that keep you out until 1 o'clock in the morning." Grace couldn't help herself. There was the same note in her voice that always led to a fight. Edward gave her a quick glance before continuing to sort through his things. "You know how it is when you find a rare piece. You have to do everything you can to make sure the client doesn't miss the chance," he said, and there was a flicker of fatigue in his tone, mixed with a touch of irritation. Grace got up from the couch and headed for the kitchen, determined not to make things worse, but the feeling that something was wrong in her marriage was growing like a snowball. Edward left the house early again in the morning, leaving her with a set of questions she didn't know how to answer. But she wasn't going to leave it at that. A few days later, sitting with Sophie over coffee at their favorite cafe, Grace told her friend about her suspicions. Sophie, though sensitive, couldn't resist a slight chuckle. "Honey, you're just jealous," she said, sipping her latte. "I've got Jackson acting weird sometimes too, especially when he's working long hours. Men are just like that. They have work and sports on their minds, and everything else seems secondary." Grace grinned in response, but inside she sensed that it wasn't about jealousy. There was something else about Edward's behavior that was almost beyond logic. He was forgetful, absent-minded. She'd noticed him checking his phone a couple times, as if he were waiting for something or someone. But whenever she asked what was wrong, he answered as if it were an insignificant question. "You see, Sophie," Grace continued, "it's not just the late returns. He's changed, and not long ago he gave me an antique locket with a ruby on it. You know I love that kind of thing, but—" Sophie raised her eyebrows in surprise. "And what was wrong with that locket?" "It looked weird," Grace said thoughtfully. "Like it had just been found in a chest in the attic. And to be honest, I've never seen it in our house before. He claims he bought it at an antique store, but I have a feeling this locket has some special meaning to him." Sophie rolled her eyes. "Grace, you're reasoning like the heroine of a cheap thriller right now. He just gave you a piece of jewelry, and you're already looking for some kind of conspiracy." "Maybe you're right," Grace sighed, but something told her she was on the right track. That evening, when Edward was late again, Grace felt she had to take a closer look at the locket. She went up to the bedroom and pulled it out of her jewelry box. The fine details of the jewelry, skillfully carved into the surface, seemed to tell its own story. It was hard to tell why she couldn't take her eyes off it, but once she lifted the lid of the locket, the engraving inside was revealed. It was just initials LK that told her nothing. For some reason, this discovery gave her a strange feeling, as if Grace had invaded someone else's privacy that had been inaccessible to her all these years. The next day, when Edward came home, she decided to put the matter to rest. "Edward, I found an engraving inside the locket," she began. "Who is LK?" Edward froze for a second, but quickly pulled himself together. "LK? I guess it's the name of the previous owner. I don't know, honestly," he replied, trying to sound as nonchalant as possible. But Grace noticed the way his fingers tightened on the doorknob. It was barely perceptible, but enough to make her suspicions grow. For a moment, the thought flashed through her mind that she was digging deeper than she should, but it was that feeling that kept her from letting things go. The days passed, and the relationship grew more and more strained. Edward barely spoke to her about work, and his late returns were the rule rather than the exception. Grace tried to keep her mask of calm, but inside she was torn with anxiety. One day she decided to stop by the store when Edward was supposed to be there. The store was in the center of town, among other old shops, and was one of those places where visitors could spend hours wandering between the shelves, looking for something unusual. When she approached the entrance, the store's lights were on, but the doors were locked. Through the window, Grace could see Edward doing something behind the counter. He wasn't alone. A woman Grace hadn't seen before was talking to him. She froze, not knowing what to do. Mixed feelings swept over her: jealousy, anger, but also a sense of relief that she wasn't crazy. Her intuition hadn't been a blank slate. When Edward came home a few hours later, she didn't immediately blame him. Instead, she just sat in the living room and watched him take off his coat and try to look like everything was business as usual. "How'd it go?" she asked carelessly. "Nothing much," came the reply. But Grace knew now that something was really going on, and her husband clearly wasn't going to tell her everything. Though she couldn't put the clues together yet, she was sure that the locket mystery was just the tip of the iceberg, and there were more chilling revelations to come. On the third day after their last tense conversation, Edward lingered at the store again. Grace didn't try to pretend she didn't notice his strange behavior, but this time she decided she wasn't going to go there herself. If he wanted to keep any details of his life from her, let it be on his conscience. However, fate had decided otherwise. Toward evening, the phone rang. It was a voice that sounded as if it brought bad news. Detective Thomas Carter. Grace immediately felt something inside her shiver, though she didn't know exactly what she was going to be told. "Mrs. Miller? This is Detective Carter. Unfortunately, I need to inform you that your husband was found dead in the store." She dropped the phone and grabbed the wall to keep her balance. The world seemed to shrink to a single point where only the thudding beats of her heart could be heard. Grace didn't remember how she got to the store. When she reached the building, there was an ambulance outside, and police officers flashed by the door. The stairs in the store were upside down, and it looked like Edward might have just slipped and fallen while sorting books from the top shelf. At first glance, his death looked like an accident, but some details kept the detectives busy. When Grace saw her husband's body covered with a white bedspread, her face didn't contort in tears or hysteria. She stood motionless, as if she couldn't fully believe what was happening, or she simply didn't know how to react. This did not go unnoticed by Detective Carter and his partner, Detective Lauren Hall, who were watching her reaction. "Mrs. Miller, you need to calm down," Carter pronounced, trying to direct her to a chair. "We understand this is difficult for you right now, but we need to ask you some questions." Grace didn't resist. She sat down with her hands mechanically folded in her lap, staring at one point as if her thoughts were somewhere far away. Carter and Hall exchanged glances, as experienced partners do when words are not required. "Mrs. Miller," Carter began, "did your husband often spend time in the store at night?" Grace looked as if she had awakened from a trance. "Yes," she answered slowly. "He said there was a lot of work to do with orders." "And what exactly was he doing? Has he had any problems lately that you know of?" The detective continued. Grace shook her head, but Carter caught something strange in her eyes, not despair, but rather relief, as if she finally had an answer to the questions that had been plaguing her. While the detectives interviewed Grace, other police officers examined the store, and soon details began to emerge that didn't fit the accident story. For example, the stairs were clearly set on a slippery surface. Perhaps someone had deliberately left a small patch of carpet nearby so that Edward could slip. But even stranger was the fact that the very same locket with the ruby was found among the books on the floor. "Is this your locket, Mrs. Miller?" Hall asked, holding the jewelry in her gloved hands. Grace nodded, not immediately realizing what it meant. "Yes," she whispered. "Edward gave it to me a few months ago. I don't know what he was doing here." A shadow of disbelief flashed in Lauren Hall's eyes, but she said nothing. Along with interviewing Grace, the detectives continued their search of the store, hoping to find something else that would shed light on the case. The next morning, Grace went back to the store to pick up Edward's things. The feeling of emptiness that engulfed her was so strong that even the familiar smell of old books seemed dark and heavy. She tried to concentrate on gathering the necessary papers and personal effects, but her thoughts kept returning to the last days of their lives. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she already realized that what had happened was no mere accident. Meanwhile, the detectives continued to work on the case. They found out that Edward was apparently engaged in some kind of business negotiations that were not related to the store. On his desk, they found a note with obscure abbreviations and phone numbers that didn't belong to any of the contacts they knew. In addition, records of recent financial transactions that detectives were able to seize showed that Edward had made transfers to accounts that, at first glance, had nothing to do with his business. When the detectives informed Grace of this, she looked confused. "I don't know anything about these cases," she said, with a noticeable weariness in her voice. But her demeanor still seemed too calm, as if her husband's death was a release for her. "Mrs. Miller," Carter continued, "can you tell me where you got this locket?" "Edward gave it to me, as I said," Grace repeated. "He bought it in an antique store." Her voice sounded mechanical, as if she were repeating words she had memorized. "Are you sure you know nothing of his affairs? You haven't had any suspicions lately?" Hall threw her an attentive glance. "I haven't followed his affairs," Grace replied. She knew she sounded lame, but she couldn't say more than what she herself knew. On their way out of the store, the detectives exchanged glances again. Hall sighed. "Have you noticed? Her demeanor is not at all in line with how widows usually behave." "She's more like someone who's gotten rid of a problem," Carter muttered, "like she's finally been let go." Meanwhile, rumors in the small town spread quickly. Some said that Grace hadn't loved Edward for a long time. Others claimed that he'd been cheating on her, and she just couldn't take it anymore. The neighbors' conversations were filled with names Grace had never even heard of, but everyone around her seemed to know more than the widow herself. At the funeral, when the crowd of friends and acquaintances gathered to see Edward off, Grace sat in the front row, clutching the locket as if it were the only thing that connected her to her husband. Several times she caught odd glances, as if people were trying to catch something in her expression. But she didn't allow herself a single tear. Detectives Carter and Hall continued to work on the case, gradually pulling more and more details from Grace and Edward Miller's lives into the light. The picture they were trying to put together was full of inconsistencies and dark spots, and each new element seemed even more confusing than the last. One of the detectives' first tasks was to interview those close to the Millers, starting with Sophie and Jackson Hudson. Sophie met them in her cozy home, furnished with little more luxury than one would expect for the wife of the owner of a small construction firm. Her face looked tired, as if she hadn't slept in several nights. "Sophie," Carter began as they sat down in the living room, "you've been friends with Grace for a long time, right? Have you noticed anything unusual in recent months? Maybe there's been some trouble between them?" Sophie bit her lip and held her breath for a moment. "You know, I hate to talk about it, but yes, there have been problems. It started about a year ago when Grace started noticing that Edward was getting colder. He stayed at work a lot, and I don't think their relationship has been like it was in the beginning for a long time." "Did you ever hear Grace complain about her husband's possible cheating?" Hall clarified. Sophie lowered her eyes. "Well, she didn't say it outright, but she did mention once that Edward was acting strangely. She felt he was hiding something important." The detectives glanced over. Sophie's answers weren't sensational, but they confirmed the line they'd already begun to trace. Jackson, who was sitting next to her, nodded, agreeing with every word his wife said. But when the detectives asked him a couple questions about his own suspicions, He couldn't hide the slightly confused look on his face. "Well, I never really got involved in their relationship much. Edward and I weren't best friends, more like buddies. But from what I understand, there were complications in their marriage." "You didn't notice Edward being intimate with anyone else?" Hall asked bluntly. Jackson hesitated, but said nonetheless, "I've seen him in the company of a woman a couple times at a cafe downtown. They were sitting pretty close and looked like they were discussing something more than just business matters." Those words got the detectives thinking. They decided to find out who the woman might have been and to check her connection to the locket that played a central role in the convoluted case. A few days later, Carter found the trail. The woman Edward had met at the cafe was named Linda Casey. That name matched the initials LC engraved on the locket. Linda was one of Edward's old acquaintances. They had met over a decade ago when he was still living in another state. When detectives contacted Linda, she didn't deny that she had met Edward a few times, but claimed that their meetings were purely business. Lauren Hall decided to meet with Linda in person to clear up some details. During the meeting, it was revealed that Linda and Edward had indeed been close in the past, but their relationship had ended abruptly, and as it turned out, not consensually. On top of that, Linda mentioned that Edward had once given her this very locket, but after their breakup, she had returned it. "So he's kept it all these years," Hall said thoughtfully, watching Linda's face, trying to figure out what she was hiding. Linda shrugged her shoulders. "I guess he didn't want me to have that locket. Maybe decided to give it to his new wife to close that gestalt, if I may say so." This information added another layer to the big picture. It appeared that the locket was not just a random antique gift, but had emotional value to Edward. Grace, for her part, was becoming an increasingly suspicious figure in the case. Her behavior was raising more and more questions for the detectives. She clearly knew more than she was saying, but she was carefully controlling her words and facial expressions. One day, Carter decided to take a different approach to the case and invited Grace for a formal interview at the police station. At first, the conversation was neutral, but Carter soon moved on to direct questions. "Mrs. Miller, were you ever aware of your husband's past relationship with Linda Casey?" he asked, looking intently into her eyes. Grace tensed for a moment, but immediately regained control. "Yes, I knew he had past affairs," she replied, keeping her tone calm. "But that was long before we met." Carter continued to press. "Did you know that locket was a gift to her, and why it was in the store the day he died?" This time, Grace hesitated. "Edward didn't tell me those details. If he decided to give me the locket, then it was his decision, and I didn't think it mattered." But this attempt to brush off the question seemed too much of a stretch. The detectives were already certain that there was much more lurking in the story than met the eye. Each new fact seemed to bring old, forgotten, but no less painful secrets to the surface. Meanwhile, the rumors in town continued to swell. Neighbors and acquaintances reported hearing screams coming from the Miller house a few days before Edward's death, and some claimed to have seen Grace leaving Edward's store the night before. One of the most memorable moments was when one of the neighbors, Mrs. Hallmark, decided to help the investigation and showed up at the police station with a whole bag of evidence, old newspapers, pictures, and even a dried rose she had supposedly found outside the store. She firmly insisted that it was a clue and had a long argument with Detective Carter, who tried to hold back laughter. "Ma'am, it's just a flower," he tried to explain. "It's not just a flower, it's a sign," Mrs. Hallmark persisted. Yet despite this amusing scene, the real evidence continued to make Grace more and more suspicious. The day they found a bag of personal belongings in Edward's car, including a diary in which he described his feelings for Linda and recounted strange events in his life, the case took a new turn. Carter and Hall felt that this story was close to being solved, but the real clue had yet to be reached. Detectives Carter and Hall delved into the details of Edward and Grace Miller's life, hoping to find key information that would help clarify their case. They already knew that the couple's relationship was not as perfect as it seemed at first glance, and that the locket with the initials LK was not just a random piece of jewelry, but evidence of years of hidden conflict. But so far, none of the evidence offered direct proof against Grace. Carter, sitting at his desk at the station, flipped through Edward's financial records. Several suspicious transactions caught his eye. Money was being transferred to anonymous accounts registered out of state, and the amount in some cases was too large to be a simple business arrangement. He called Hall to discuss the finding. "Look at this," Carter said, showing her the statements. "These transfers started months ago, and from the looks of it, Edward was trying to hide something. Or someone was trying to cover it up for him," Hall added, studying the documents. "I wonder if Grace knew about it. Those financial records weren't enough to warrant charges, but they did indicate that Grace may have been aware of her husband's hidden affairs." Detectives decided to interview several witnesses who could shed light on the last months of Edward's life. Jackson Hudson, who had been in frequent contact with Edward and may have known more about his affairs than he had previously told them, was called in again. "Yes, Edward told me he wanted to invest in a new project," Jackson admitted, rubbing his hands together nervously. "But he didn't go into details. All he said was that it had to do with something old and valuable. I didn't think it was that serious." Carter looked at him intently. "And you didn't know he was transferring large sums of money into anonymous accounts?" Jackson looked embarrassed. "No, he didn't tell me anything like that. I knew he had some problems, but I didn't think they involved finances." After Jackson left, Hall sighed. "He obviously doesn't know any more than he said he did, but we're missing something. That money didn't just disappear." At that moment, Carter got a call from the call analysis department. The night before Edward's death, an anonymous call had been made from his store. The timing of the call coincided with the moment when Edward, according to witnesses, had already closed the store and was inside alone. Someone called a local number that led to a service that provided legal advice. The recording of the call was short, and the recording showed a garbled voice asking for information on a specific debt-related case. Carter wondered, why would Edward be calling about a legal matter at a time like this? And why is the voice altered? Hall added, "It could be his attempt to find out something related to his affairs, or it could be in an attempt to divert attention from his real motive. But what does this have to do with Grace?" Meanwhile, detectives conducted a second interview with Linda Casey. This time, their questions were not only about the locket, but also about her relationship with Edward. "Tell me, Linda," Carter began, "were you aware of his financial difficulties? Did he ask you for help?" Linda looked surprised, but then frowned. "No, he didn't tell me anything like that, but we did discuss old times a few times. Perhaps he just wanted to keep in touch with me." "And you never noticed him being concerned about anything serious? Maybe he mentioned Grace?" Hall asked. Linda hesitated for a moment. "No, he rarely talked about her, but once mentioned that she wouldn't like it if she found out about our past. That was a long time ago, though." After talking to Linda, the detectives realized they were missing important pieces to their puzzle. They began checking Grace's phone records for the past few months. They were soon able to discover that she had been in contact with a lawyer specializing in divorce proceedings just a week before Edward's death. Hall looked over the notes and glanced at Carter. "Do you think it was a coincidence, or was she already planning something bigger?" Carter wondered. If she knew about Edward's financial problems and wanted to file for divorce, maybe she was looking for a way to make sure he wouldn't leave her with nothing, and this locket story could be just the tip of the iceberg. The new information made Grace an even more suspicious figure in the eyes of the police, but there was still no direct evidence of her guilt. They decided to search her home for anything that might shed light on her involvement in Edward's affairs. During the search, they found a note hidden between papers in one of the drawers of Grace's desk. It was a scrap of paper with an address and phone number that matched the legal aid office where the anonymous call had been made. Carter and Hall glanced over it. "This is clearly not a coincidence," Carter said, looking at the note. She knew where Edward called, and probably knew why. Now they had not just a hypothesis, but an important piece of evidence related to Grace. However, her role in the story remained not entirely clear. Was she just an observer, or was she actively involved in manipulating her husband's finances in an attempt to protect herself? The investigation had been going on for weeks now, and Grace felt the circle tightening ever tighter around her. Detectives Carter and Hall were exerting an invisible but palpable pressure. The questions became more and more direct, and their stares seemed penetrating. And though Grace continued to hold on, a sense of impending disaster grew stronger and stronger inside her. The climax came the day the detectives invited Grace to the police station for a final interview. They assured her it was just a formality, but the tone was significant enough for her to realize. The case was coming to a close. There was a tense silence in the interrogation room where their meetings usually took place, and the sound of the closing door sent a chill through her body. Carter began the conversation in his usual tone, polite, but with a dose of insistence. "Mrs. Miller, we'd like to discuss some new facts that have come to light during our investigation." He opened a folder of documents and photographs in front of her, one of which showed a close-up of the very same locket. "You mentioned you didn't know its significance, didn't you?" he began, not taking his gaze off her face. Grace nodded without saying a word, but her eyes did flutter open, betraying an inner worry. "The thing is," Carter continued, "this locket wasn't a random purchase. Nor was it a purchase, for that matter. It belonged to Linda Casey, your rival. She told us about their past with your husband and how you knew of their liaison long before his death." Grace's face froze for a moment, but then she said with a slight smile, "I knew about Linda, but that's long in the past. What's the big deal here? Is jealousy a sufficient motive for murder?" Hall, who had been silent until then, took a step forward. "It's not just jealousy, Mrs. Miller. We found some things that indicate your deliberate interference in Edward's life. For example, notes that indicated your awareness of his financial problems, of his attempts to hide his dealings from you. We also have testimony that you were near the store the day he died." Grace frowned and closed her eyes for a moment. Her face lost its former cold confidence. But then, as if she had made up her mind, she opened her eyes again and met their gazes with a fearlessness no one expected. "Yes," she began quietly, "I knew about Linda, and I knew about Edward keeping in touch with her even after we were married. But it wasn't just that." She sighed and continued, in a voice that grew firmer with each word. "He betrayed me much earlier than you could have imagined. When we first started dating, I helped him get out of the debt he'd racked up because of his store. I gave him everything I had. And then I found out that all this time he'd been investing in projects with Linda and even tried to hide the profits from me. It was like a knife in the back." Carter listened intently without interrupting. Hall kept her eyes on Grace, who seemed finally relieved of the burden she'd been carrying all these years. "And what did you do when you found that out?" Carter asked. Grace looked him straight in the eye. "At first I tried to forgive," she answered. "I tried to maintain our perfect marriage, hoping it was just a mistake. But the further I delved into his affairs, the more I realized he would never change. He was so good at hiding the truth that I had to get better at revealing it." Her voice became almost icy. "I set it up to make his death look like an accident. Yes, I knew he was going up those stairs in the store. I left it slightly offset so he wouldn't notice. I put a mat under his feet so he'd slip. I did everything I could to make an accident look like fate." Hall couldn't contain her surprise. "You mean you planned this in advance?" "Yes," Grace confirmed calmly. "I needed to be sure his life would end exactly the way I wanted it to. Not in the hospital from old age, not surrounded by friends, but among his favorite books, in the very cage he'd built for himself." Carter continued, trying to find even the slightest remorse in her eyes. "You killed him out of jealousy?" Grace grinned, but there was more bitterness than joy in that smile. "Jealousy? No, it was something much deeper than that. It was revenge for what he did to me. For the years I spent thinking we were building something together, when in fact he was leading a double life. It wasn't a temper tantrum. It was a cold-blooded decision. And now that it's over, I feel like I'm finally free." The detectives were left stunned by her confession, not because of what she had done, but because of the confidence and even pride with which she admitted it. There was something in her words that made one wonder how far a person could go when they were cheated not only in love, but also in trust. As Grace was led out of the room, Carter turned to Hall and said, "You know, sometimes I think the truth can be scarier than any fiction." Hall nodded, but there was still a spark of disbelief burning in her eyes. Yes, but she obviously knew how to present her side of the story in a way that would make us sympathize, if not sympathize, at least understand. The ending of the story left everyone with a twofold feeling. On the one hand, Grace's motive was understandable. Her actions were explained by years of resentment and an attempt to free herself from the past, which had become too heavy a burden for her. On the other hand, her cold-bloodedness and ability to carefully plan her husband's murder were astonishing in their ruthlessness. Several months had passed since the Edward Miller case had closed. Grace confessed that she was the one who had planned his death and was convicted of premeditated murder. Her confession had a bombshell effect, but for those who knew her intimately, it didn't come as a complete surprise. The image of the perfect wife she had maintained for so long turned out to be only a facade hiding a deeply wounded and bitter woman. Carter sat at his desk at the station, contemplating all that had happened. His colleagues had long since moved on to new cases, but this case remained in his mind like a lingering puzzle. He understood Grace's motives: years of resentment, betrayal, jealousy that had turned into bitter revenge, but it was her cold determination that kept him awake. Hall walked over and perched on the edge of his desk. "Still thinking about her?" she asked, raising the cup of coffee to her lips. Carter nodded, pulling himself away from his thoughts. "You know, I sometimes think we haven't quite figured things out in this case. It's like we found answers, but not the truth she was trying to hide." "She never told us why she made that anonymous call," Hall added, taking a sip. "I still doubt she only wanted to frame Edward. There was more to it than that." "Yeah, but we'll never know again," Carter sighed. "Sometimes the truth goes away with the people who created it." Grace, now in her jail cell, was looking at the same old books Edward had loved. There was no regret or relief in her face, just a silence that seemed to finally allow her to feel free. She still held the locket in her hands, a reminder of her victory and the bitterness of that victory at the same time. For some, her story would remain a chilling example of how far a person could go for justice in their own way. But for Grace, it was only a necessity, an act of release from years of pain and betrayal. And though her actions had been horrible, she herself was sure she had done the right thing. She looked at the locket in her hands and whispered softly, "It's finally over."